Hey, Blogging Heads viewers, I'm Eli Lake, Washington Times New Republic, and I'm joined by my friend Hussein Ibish from the American Task Force on Palestine, and probably the most prolific commenter in the English language and on the blogosphere regarding the events of what is being called the Arab Spring.
On my
Hussein,
blog,
it is terrific
ibishblog.com.
to have you with.
Yeah, let's not forget where it is. It's on ibishblog.com.
And it's, I'm sorry, ibishblog.com, of course, which you'll see the link to. Everyone go check it out. I don't think, Hussein, you've been getting any sleep because you've been writing like 2 or 3 items a day and appearing on the Arab satellite stations. It's just you've been a busy guy.
Yeah, I've been a busy guy. But it's a busy time, and somebody's got to do it.
We've all been busy, but so we're really lucky to have you. So let's get right into it.
My pleasure.
We want to talk about the Obama doctrine.
Right.
And as the reporter, I'm going to first say I don't have settled thoughts on this yet. So I would like to kind of kick it off to you.
Sure.
What is, at this point, the Obama doctrine?
Okay, well, I agree to some extent with Michael Hirsch that the Obama doctrine, to some extent, is no doctrine at all, in the sense that, as usual, Obama is being, I think, more pragmatic and a little bit more sophisticated than some of his predecessors, in that he really isn't laying out a one-size-fits-all model for U.S. intervention in overseas crises. What he did was lay out a series of criteria that would justify a U.S. involvement in an intervention, and he laid down some also conditions in which that would have to be necessary. So let's talk about those. The most important thing he did was he stressed the confluence of interests and values. In other words, what he was suggesting is that it's not enough simply to have the values of the United States threatened. Otherwise, we'd be intervening in Cote d'Ivoire, in the Congo, in Bahrain, in Yemen, and all over the world. And we not only can't afford to do that, it would be very strange and inappropriate in every way to do that. So there's got to be a question of values and interests coming together. Okay, and he stressed very much the humanitarian angle because he was talking to the general public and he was trying to appeal to people's emotions and their patriotism, and he did a masterful job. I don't doubt that as the Gaddafi forces were approaching Benghazi and looked like retaking all of Libya, there was serious, legitimate, realistic concern for, as they put it, another Srebrenica, that he was perfectly ready, willing, and able to conduct a massacre in that city. And I don't think that's a far-fetched notion at all. In fact, I think it was a very real threat. And you can base that on his own words. You really don't have to imagine any other scenario. Just listen to what he was saying and look at what he was doing, and you will come to that conclusion. But even that is not enough, because, you see, you have to put the Obama speech in the context of several weeks of hesitation when people like me and many others were calling vociferously for a no-fly zone. And the West hesitated, particularly the Obama administration. And they did so because I think they felt they could live with a Libyan civil war. They could live with unrest in Libya. They could live with a protracted conflict. But when Gaddafi's troops started bearing down on Benghazi, they were confronted with a prospect they really hadn't considered before, which was, what if this guy actually succeeded in really retaking his country and all its oil wealth, and he emerged bloodied, embittered, enraged, infuriated, psychotic, and with a new vengeance agenda that goes far beyond Libya and probably far beyond the Middle East, and that then the United States, the international community, and the Arabs would all have to deal with this guy. Was that an acceptable outcome in terms of U.S. interests? And so I think the answer was no. So what Obama was trying to explain was there isn't necessarily a doctrine here, but what we had was a great confluence of our values in terms of not standing by and watching a massacre on the one hand, and our interests in terms of not having a crazed, empowered, and enraged dictator suddenly take control of a wealthy and strategically located country again. And because those two things came together, action had to be taken. The other two things he said that were important, I think, were that the United States didn't want to act alone. It wanted to act in concert with others. That's partly because we're a broke power, even though we're still a superpower. We don't really have a lot of check writing capability at the moment. And partly because it's very important to distinguish this action from some kind of other intervention. In other words, it really was important to act in conjunction with not only with NATO, but with Arab forces as well. The Arab League approval of this was important. Now, it's my opinion, and I argued very vociferously on the Ibish blog, that with every passing day after Gaddafi's first psychotic speech in which he claimed the whole thing was a joint Al-Qaeda American plot involving the followers of bin Laden putting hallucinogenic pills in the Nescafe of juvenile delinquents, and that he was going to cleanse Libya house by house, and that those who did not love him deserved to die, that was the moment to strike, in the sense that, for me, and here we got this from the president as well, and I was very pleased to hear it from him, one of the great virtues of this intervention in Libya is that it not only brings together our values and our interests, as I've just described, but it also puts us on the right side of the Arab Spring. What it communicates to the Arab world is that the United States and the West are not so addicted to oil and regional stability that we will regard any dramatic or revolutionary change in the Arab world as undesirable, even though we could live with Gaddafi. We were living with him. He was selling us oil, and we really didn't have a problem with him until the uprising began and he started going crazy. But the point is that while it may not be possible to intervene, say, against the government of Bahrain, which is a strategic ally, and the Fifth Fleet is located there, and when there's a question of Iranian influence and all of that, and there'll have to be different responses from the U.S. in different Arab reform movements and uprisings. This was a perfect moment for the United States to intervene in a way that was humanitarian and also strategically and politically put us on the right side of history. Now, I would argue, and I did argue, that with every passing day after the first week after Gaddafi's initial insane speech, we lost momentum in that regard, and it started to look more and more hesitant, reluctant, and more like an intervention in a civil war, which is really what it's become. So we lost some points there, but I think we didn't lose all of them. It wasn't too late, and Obama was right to say that this puts us on the right side of that track of history. So that's the way I read this speech, and I have to say, I almost felt like he was channeling my blog, although I'm sure no one anywhere remotely near the White House has ever read it. And it was a moment for me where I really felt, almost for the first time in my life, on a foreign policy issue, my president was saying exactly what I wanted him to say. It was a great personal moment for me.
Let me probe you on a couple things.
Sure.
Point one: if the United States is supposed to be on the right side of the Arab Spring, how is that enhanced by getting the approval of the Arab League, which is a collection of despots that the Arab Spring, in many cases, seems to be arrayed against?
Well, in fact, as I argued, let me stop you there and address that. I argued, in fact, in several of my writings, that it would have been even better to act before the approval of the Arab League.
Okay. So on that we agree.
It only helps diplomatically, government to government. It doesn't help with communicating that to the Arab peoples. However, it is further diplomatic cover, and it does allow the president to say to the Americans and to the rest of the world, including the Arabs, hey, everyone agrees with this. So it's not just us, which has its own virtue. I would have preferred swift unilateral action without asking anybody's permission on the grounds that this is a rescue operation to protect a vulnerable Arab people from a crazed dictator threatening massacres. And it really wasn't a full-fledged civil war at that point, and it would have looked really different, and it would have had an amazing impact. This same kind of speech given 4 weeks ago would have been historic in a very different way. It was good for what it was. It was great for what it was, but it's neither too little, too late. But it would have had a hell of a different impact 4 weeks ago. Of course, I understand why they held back. They were worried about the outcome, of controlling the outcome. They were worried about who would come to power in Libya, and whether Libya would disintegrate and what the outcome would be. And there's this very reasonable idea that in foreign policy, as in medicine, first do no harm. But in this case, I think we partly missed an opportunity to do something very spectacularly useful for us in a long-term strategic relationship with the Arab peoples. We didn't miss it completely, but we let some of the best value of it slip away. And I agree, getting permission from the Arab League only serves certain purposes. It undermines the one that I was talking about.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, let me just give you my kind of quick takeaway on what an Obama done. I mean, I kind of agree with you. I don't have a clear kind of sense of what exactly it is. But I would point out that, there's a paradox, and it's not just Obama, it's a paradox of the progressives, it's a paradox of the Democratic Party as it approaches sort of the role in the world. And I think, it comes down to the role of the United States, because I think it's fair to say that there's maybe a part of Obama's brain, or there's a part of the Democratic Party, there's a part of the progressive movement, I'm not trying to necessarily quantify it, that resents American exceptionalism. And I don't mean to say that to be provocative. I don't mean to say that to be, I say it as I think that's clear from reading progressives for the many years that I have been.
Okay.
And then I think that there's another side of the coin, and let me finish here for a second, because I want to make a point about Obama's Libya speech and potentially a doctrine here. Mm-hmm. There's another side of the Democratic coin that, Steve Wall, conspiracy theorist that he is, recently sort of said is like the flip side of neoconservatism. In my first dialogue with Heather Hurlbert, I mentioned that neocons and Kosovo Democrats were, very similar. Maybe they differed on the usefulness of the UN, but they believed in muscular U.S. power in pursuit of values, which I think Paul Wolfowitz would say are our interests. And then I want to just quote from the actual Obama speech, because this is, I think, very important, because despite the fact that, he got the Arab League and, the Council of Micronesian Elders and the
UN
Society for the Export, every
UN Security Council
group
that's
had to,
important.
Weigh in and say this was okay. I'm kidding.
Please don't leave out the Security Council.
Yes, of course, the UN Security
Thank
Council,
you.
But not a resolution of force from the U.S. Congress. Though I guess there were some consultations. What he says is, and I think this is important because in the speech, he gives all the he says this is what Gaddafi was doing. He compared his citizens to rats.
Yep.
We knew that if we waited one more day, Benghazi, a city of nearly the size of Charlotte, could suffer a massacre that would have reverberated across the region and stained the conscience of the world. That's very powerful. But then he says, it was not in our national interest to let that happen. And then he goes, and this is the part that I found so interesting, that happen. And so 9 days ago, after consulting the bipartisan leadership of Congress, I authorized military action to stop the killing and enforce UN Security Council Resolution 1973. And that, I think, is extremely important, because in the subject of those sentences, Obama is not only is Obama saying that it's coming down to the decision of one man, the American president, which is a pretty American exceptionalist thing you have to sort of do when you hold that chair. The other thing is that at the end of the day, we should have this link here, Hussein, on the side. There's a video of Dewey Claridge, a former, someone who I know really well, a kind of source of mine, but also a former head of the CIA's Latin America division, being interviewed by John Pilger, a very far left Australian. And he's asked at one point, when do you intervene? And he said, national security interests. Like, not even thinking about it. But if you really wipe away everything here, and he did, and Obama did do all these things with the UN Security Council, he consulted allies, he did all these things that everybody likes. But at the end of the day, he said, it was not in our national security interest to let it happen, and so we didn't let it happen.
Correct.
And
that's it.
That's it.
Well, of course, that's the point I was making.
Yeah.
Let me respond to everything you've
so
just
I'm
said.
just saying, I just said he's an exceptionalist, is my point. Is that, like, Obama's an American exceptionalist?
Well, he's an American president, okay?
Yeah.
Which means that he asserts his prerogatives as the commander-in-chief. He says, I wouldn't let this happen. I decided to do this.
Yep.
And we've never had a president, and I will say we will never have a president unless there are serious constitutional changes, who doesn't take that position. This is the prerogative of the president, and he asserted that. Also,
but it's not the prerogative of the president of France. President of France.
Well, it's the prerogative of the president of the United States. Well, it's the prerogative of the president of the United States, and we're talking about the United States here. Okay, so and Obama is the president of the United States. So he asserted the prerogatives of his office, as all presidents have and will do into the future. Number one. Number two, he asserted the right of the United States to act unilaterally with or without anybody's permission if it felt its vital national interests and its security were at stake. Now, what he said is that in this case, although our security was not threatened, he said, this is exactly what he said, our security was not threatened by this, but our values and our interests were. Now, you have to read this speech carefully, I think, because he emphasized the humanitarian stuff, okay, which is all true. But behind it lay the idea that I just laid out that is the outcome of a Gaddafi victory in Libya acceptable from an American, international, and even an Arab point of view, but especially from an American point of view? And the answer resoundingly is no. Look at the chronology. There was hesitation for more than a month when the whole thing was just a deteriorating civil war. The minute his forces started to converge on Benghazi and the prospect of a total victory of Gaddafi emerged, it wasn't so much the potential massacre, although that was clearly a factor, but more the prospect of having to deal with this man, bloodied, enraged, infuriated, vengeful, oil-rich, now ruling over that country, and as I say, with that vengeance agenda. Was that acceptable? The answer from President Obama individually was no. I'm not going to allow that to happen. I am going to intervene, and I'm going to stop it. Well done, well said, good job. Now, he didn't put it as bluntly as that. It was all woven together with great artfulness and skillfulness. But yes, he's talking about a reality in which the United States will act to defend its interests, especially when its values are also at stake here, even if its security isn't directly threatened at that moment. And this is not a doctrine, it is a set of criteria for action. And there's a difference between the two. And I much prefer a president who lays out a series of coherent criteria for action rather than someone who promulgates some kind of one-size-fits-all doctrine that usually end up as either historical remnants or laughingstocks.
Okay, well, I mean, whatever. But okay, fine. And I kind of, I'm not at a point yet where I'm willing to sort of assert these are the three elements of Obama's, doctrine of foreign policy. But I think it's important.
Well, I'm saying it's a non-doctrine. I'm saying it's their
Obama
criteria.
has many times appeared and kind of tried to cast himself as a president that is more humble than Bush, a president that is multilateral, where Bush was unilateral, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end,
I actually can I slightly dissent from that? The person who used the word humble was Bush.
Well,
the
originally,
first
but I'm
Bush
just
foreign
saying,
policy.
originally, I'm saying that
pre-9/11.
Obama clearly,
hold on
come on,
just a
he
second.
bows in front of the Saudi king, and
Hold on.
I'm just saying
that was look. Don't be ridiculous. Okay, look. The one who used the word humble
Originally was Bush and Kanye.
Was Bush, right? Then he had an overly aggressive foreign policy that led to all kinds of, disastrous mistakes like the invasion of Iraq. And instead of a doctrinaire president, we have a pragmatic president who's more interested in criteria for intervention than theoretical models for intervention. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, rather than having a theory of intervention, he has a set of thresholds that have to be met.
I don't know. You know what, Hussein? I'm gonna push back finally. Okay. Absolute. You know what? I agree. I think you should have stopped the massacre in Benghazi, and I think it would have been disastrous had Gaddafi held on to power. Okay. But if things heat up in Syria, all right, I think it's also disastrous for Assad to be in power. I think it's disastrous that that mullahs in Iran managed to basically quash the June 12 movement. There's a series of things that are bad for U.S. interests that Obama chose not to act. He did choose to act in Libya, and while I agree with you that it's probably premature to come up with a doctrine, to sort of, act like, oh my God, what a wise and brilliant president, I'm not so sure.
First of all, okay, let's take those two examples. I'm not calling him wise or brilliant. I'm saying I'm impressed. I'm saying I'm impressed with it, okay? Yeah. Now that's... I'm not proclaiming him wise or brilliant. I like this better than the doctrinaire versions we've had before. Let's take the two examples you had before. First of all, the situation in Syria is extremely complicated, and we are nowhere near the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. There is a potential for internal reform there. I doubt it, but it's possible. It's very complicated. And the two countries that are most against intervening to remove Bashar al-Assad are the two greatest regional rivals of Syria, Israel and Saudi Arabia. They are desperate to keep him in power for various reasons, and they stopped the Bush administration from pursuing a regime change policy with regard to Syria, and I don't think the Obama administration...
I don't think that's right. I don't know that there was ever really a serious regime change policy for Syria, but okay.
I think there's no doubt. I mean, I'm sure of this.
I don't think Bush really ever. Okay, but
I think they considered it seriously and were told not to. Now, with regard to Iran, with regard to Iran, the question is, what could you have done that would have helped the uprising? I mean, there was a very fine line here between supporting the Green Movement in certain effective ways and doing things that would have undermined it. And basically the leaders of the Green Movement, everyone from the leftists who were involved to Mossavi and Karoubi, really did want the U.S. to keep a distance. They wanted certain kinds of support, but certainly nothing like an intervention. And plus, there's no chance of any. It wasn't the same kind of thing. So I think here we're mixing apples and oranges. And
do you think that 1,000 trained fighters in Libya have a chance of overthrowing Gaddafi? I mean, I'm asking you. I mean, like how do we know these rebels have a chance to unseat Gaddafi?
I think they clearly do. They've had significant successes on the battlefield, and with more training, with more arms, and with more air support, I think they can. Yes, I think they can. I think his days are numbered.
I hope you're right. I'm just saying that.
I think they can.
Okay, I hope you're right. I hope you're right.
And no one knows.
On the Iran thing, I think
a better example. But Eli, hold on.
Yeah, on the Iran.
Eli, a better example from your point of view would be to ask, why no action in Bahrain? Okay, when there really was extreme, excessive.
No, I disagree. I don't want to go to Bahrain. I want to go back to Iran for a second. On Iran, it's very clear that I know what a lot of the members of the opposition did not want the U.S. to come in and own their movement or something like that because it would have been perilous for them.
Correct.
Because they had to pursue a nonviolent strategy. So the notion that there could have been a no-fly zone or some sort of kinetic intervention. In that sense,
a war with Iran is
however, the Obama administration held open the prospect and continued to probe for negotiations with a government that was clearly seen as illegitimate. And at the moment when the Green Movement was going all over Europe and in the Western world saying no recognition for a coup d'etat government, that is exactly what they said, the Obama administration was still continuing the notion that they would have an entente on the nuclear file with Ahmadinejad-led government. And that, by the way, I think in many ways, that was I agree with you. You can't own these things. The point is that you want to have a democratic revolution. They have to be organic, and you cannot have the United States kind of claiming credit for authorship. And so on this, I'm not going to debate that. However, that I think that this non-proliferation agenda and this, diplomacy agenda, and I'll sit down and talk with anyone agenda that was a residue of the 2008, undermined the Iranian opposition. And I think that it finally seems that Obama has come around to the view that the mullahs have no interest in diplomacy, and now the latest Nowruz statement was wonderful. He named political prisoners. He did not mention the nuclear file. He talked about human rights. That I applaud, but it seems like, okay, what took you so long? Two
things, Eli. First of all, you can no longer talk about the mullahs because the mullahs are no longer in charge of Iran. Okay. It's the Pazaran and the Basij with this Khamenei figurehead. Okay. The clerics in Iran are extremely angry that their regime has been hijacked by a gang of armed thugs and illiterate hooligans. So they're pissed off. Okay. So it's not the mullahs. That's number one. Number two, the Obama administration faced a very difficult choice there because on the one hand, they did want to support the Green Movement, and I was a huge supporter of it, and I still am, and I don't think it's dead. I think it's
I agree.
There's a lull. But here's the thing. Iran is a very serious, important power, and there are very serious, important negotiations to be had with it on Iraq, on Afghanistan, on the nuclear file, on many issues. And so to cut off contact with the government just because they rigged an election and were brutalizing demonstrators is when there was really very little chance that they were actually about to be overthrown would have been a very diplomatically risky thing to do. So it's a tough call. I don't know what decision I would have made. I would have wanted to have a lot more of the classified information that I had access to. In that case, I can understand both decisions. It would have pleased me if they had withdrawn all forms of recognition. But then that would have caused incredible problems with regard to Iraq. So it's not a simple matter in Iran.
Okay, and I want to go back to Syria for a second. That's a newer situation, okay? Yeah. But on the Sunday shows, you had Bob Gates say it was not our interest to take sides in this matter. And then you had Hillary Clinton who said, I have to say the full extent of her comments were, we're watching if it heats up, but it's not the same right now. We couldn't get Arab League approval, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess,
but there's it's not the same thing. What we have going on in Syria is not the same thing as what we have going on in Libya. We don't have a government calling people rats, threatening to go house by house, etc. There's an interesting.
You have a government militia that's clearly cracking down on peaceful demonstrators. You have had a history of secret police in Bashar Assad in the Assad family for 40 years.
Yes, and that's true. That's true.
And certainly disappeared people. And if you want to look at it from a humanitarian perspective, because the killing doesn't happen all at once and on camera, it happens over weeks, months, and years. Then
you're right.
It's different, I suppose.
No, you're right. Right. You're absolutely right, and it's even more true in Yemen and in Bahrain and in several other countries. Syria is not the second worst example at the moment. It's maybe the most interesting, but Syria is a very complicated, dynamic country. And
but Syria is like an enemy of the United States in a way that Bahrain and Yemen. Or at least the government of Bahrain are allies of the United States. Now, I'm not saying that's a free pass, but I'm saying that there's there's a totally different set of things you do. I mean, like in the case of Mubarak, I have no doubt that Field Marshal Zentawi is on the phone with Bob Gates, is on the phone with General Mattis, is on the phone with U.S. military figures or the president or whoever. They're probably the message is don't fire on those demonstrators. So you use your influence with governments that are your allies behind the scenes in a way that you don't when you are dealing with a Gaddafi, which is not exactly an ally.
Fine. I agree with you. Yeah. I have no truck with the Syrian regime at all.
I know.
Okay,
you don't. I'm not saying you do.
None. Okay,
right.
But here's the thing. I do know that the U.S. allies in the region, the two most important ones, Israel and Saudi Arabia, are absolutely committed to not getting rid of that regime for complicated reasons, and that's something the Obama administration has to take into consideration. The situation in Syria is not ripe for any kind of direct intervention yet. It is developing. The movement is very inchoate. What happened in Daraa is very it's inchoate is the right word. It's brewing. It's developing.
Yeah.
And let's see. And what happened in Latakia, same thing. So let's see what happens in Syria. But to leap from the Libyan situation to the Syrian situation is really to go from.
But my point was not to say that why Libya and why Libya and not Syria. That was not my point. My point was that when it doesn't reach the point of intervention as it did in Libya, okay, the position does not have to be it's a family squabble and none of our business. Nor does the position.
No.
And I felt that
I
was maybe this was just poor messaging. And by the way, in the grand scheme of things, a Sunday talk show appearance, right, is, easily correctable with a couple statements. You know what I'm saying? So the policy may be changing from the Obama administration.
They are irrelevant.
I think that there's an important
Sunday talk shows
here,
are irrelevant.
Obama, I'll just say, I think Obama went into office thinking that the Bush administration was responsible for the enmity of countries and for the poor state of relationships, whether it was we need to do a reset with Russia, or whether it was we're going to outreach to Iran, and I think that this has largely been shown not to be the case. That despite years of engagement going back to Warren Christopher's many visits to Damascus in the first Clinton term, the Assad family has not really changed its tune at all. It hasn't. It just.
No, you're right. If it's changed in ways that are even less good than before.
I guess that there's a broader kind of notion, and it's not a doctrine, but there's a broader notion that neocons and Bushies, they hate engagement, but we're going to try real engagement, and it's going to work. And that did.
Right. Let's talk about the difference for a second. You're right. There's a real difference, and you've put your finger on the two of them. The Obama administration came in saying the Bush administration made two fundamental mistakes. It damaged bilateral and multilateral relations. We're going to fix those, and I think they've done a pretty good job at that, and it's been helpful. The second thing was they said, well, what we need to emphasize, especially in the Middle East, is stability. Stability above all. Now that has proven to be an approach that was inappropriate to the moment that emerged. And so I think they get a lot of credit on the first, and they've really had to rethink and recalibrate on the second. On the other hand, you can't overstate the Bush administration's brilliance on this issue, because their retooling of Middle East strategy as embodied in that paper called the Greater Middle East Initiative was absolutely scrapped when the Iraqi insurgency began, and no policy was ever really based on it. The only big difference you could point to was the kind of money that was spent on democracy promotion by Bush and retooled by Clinton and Obama in the new administration. So that's a criticism that's reasonable to make, and I think it's clear that the overemphasis on stability didn't set the United States up in a good position once the Tunisian and Egyptian things started, and it has been possible for Elliott Abrams and other Bush administration officials to gloat that they were right, but unfortunately for them, they didn't actually base a lot of their policies, other than some of their aid programs, on that freedom agenda, with the exception, of course, of the war in Iraq, which is a whole other.
And as you guys could, viewers, please read what I think is a fair but tough critique of the aborted effort to try to press Mubarak to open up Egypt in 2005. And, I lived there for it, and I have to say that it was extremely disappointing to see.
It's a good article. I encourage everybody to read it.
I encourage people to read.
I think it's a very good article.
Your stuff. I don't want to get. I don't, and I'm not the best person to be. I'm a reporter first. I'm not a polemicist, so I'm not the best person to kind of make the strongest case for Bush. But I do find it interesting that what you said about Elliott,
he's doing a good job of it.
Like Elliott, very much.
He's doing a good job of it. He's a smart guy, and he's doing it well. So you can leave it to Elliott.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing at this moment, Obama has asserted that it's his call, it's America's call to prevent these sort of catastrophes. And that there's a whole realm of other things. I mean, that we didn't even talk about in the Libya speech. He talks about freezing something like $40 billion in assets of the Libyan government. Now, I just thought to myself,
more than that.
Sometimes I like to put, like, how is Glenn Greenwald looking at this, right? And I'm thinking, like, he's probably saying, what if some other country decided to freeze $40 billion in assets? No other country can do that. So, as I see it, there really is, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think this comes down to what is America's role in the world? And do you think America should play by the same rules as every other nation? Now, there was a strain of the critique of the Iraq War, which said that it was not a blunder so much as it was a crime, that comes from the view that America does not have the kind of divine right to act in an exceptional way and to assert and to sort of marshal all of this power. And I'm not saying that wasn't everybody. I don't think it was you. In fact, I'm almost positive, based on our earlier conversation, it was not you.
Well, let me say, let me.
But
okay. Well, first of all, okay. Sorry.
Okay. So, but there were many people that would be on, for lack of a better word, the left in the Democratic Party that do think that, and Obama is not their guy.
Correct. Okay. Correct. Now let's say this. First of all, nobody has a divine right to anything because there's no divine anything. So let's take the divine right off the table, and this I insist this discussion remain agnostic and skeptical.
Quote some holy books.
Does the United States does the United States have a special set of rights internationally? From a legal point of view, no, but from a practical point of view, without doubt. The United States has a unique role, and this simply cannot be ignored. And there will be moments, as every president has always asserted, including this one. And I don't care who becomes president, unless, I mean, even Kucinich or someone like that would still have to say that, listen, if we find it necessary to act without anybody else's approval, we are going to do that. And Obama was very clear about that, and he was right to be clear about that. Now, the Iraq War, the problem was, of course, not simply that it was illegal. That's not the biggest problem with it. And it's not. Well, the problem was that we asked for permission. And we didn't get permission, then we did it anyway. So if you're going to do it, in an unlawful way, just do it.
But Ibish, may I turn around and say, what if China, because of some deal we didn't know about for rare minerals in Libya, said, no, we're gonna veto your little intervention? At that point, you're just like, okay, well, the people of Benghazi must perish. I mean, is that what the policy is? Is that what the view is?
I have told you already. I have already told you that I think that this should have been done immediately, without anyone's approval, with as many partners as possible. But I wouldn't have waited more than a week after Gaddafi's first speech, and I certainly wouldn't have waited for the Arab League, and I wouldn't have waited for the Security Council.
President Ibish,
I wouldn't have.
Pays the cost to be the boss.
You know why? Let me tell you why. No, but let me explain exactly why. Because the biggest benefit of this to the United States is its repositioning of the way American power relates to the process of Arab reform and democratization and change, okay? That's the great opportunity.
Oh, come on, but Saddam Hussein, and then despite the counsel of the CIA and Senator Kerry when he was running, Bush said, you know what, we are going to go with these elections. And they did not look good at first because they empowered a coalition that included Muqtada Sadr. But over time, they've had more national elections. And I'm not saying that Iraq is perfect at this point, but it's a lot better than Saddam Hussein. And I'm saying that notion of Arab reform, while I understand the Arab public very much resented the U.S. intervention in Iraq, I get that. I've seen the polling data. But the Arab public is wrong, Hussein.
I'm trying to
get over the fact
that
it was ridiculous for them to support the so-called resistance in Iraq. Those resistance were akin to the Jim Crow Ku Klux Klan.
It doesn't help it doesn't help anybody for you to sit around and say the Arabs are stupid.
I didn't say they were stupid. I just say they were wrong
to
on
change
Iraq.
their minds, or just they're wrong. Fine, maybe they're wrong, but you know what? They have their opinion. You have your opinion, and it's strategically from an American point of view, in terms of our relationship with the Arab peoples who are becoming actors in the Middle East, a region vital to our security. We need to seriously try to use our power to enhance our position vis-a-vis Arab change, to put ourselves on right now. Invoking Iraq is not going to help. I'm sorry. It just isn't.
I'm
it
not
might
saying
make
that
you
you
feel
should
good, but it's
Iraq
not going to
in
work.
a
What
US
is,
public
what
diplomacy
would have worked,
campaign
no,
in the
listen,
Middle East.
listen.
I'm
hold on.
pointing out that
Listen,
Eli Lake, who's been to Iraq 3 times to observe that and has a special interest in that country and its development, would like to say, having had many conversations with many Arabs in the region who've explained to me how terrible and imperialist it was and how they supported the resistance, that this was ultimately a position. And I don't want. I mean, it's dangerous to talk about all of the Arabs. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the kind of view that I've encountered that has been this kind of typical, opposition to the Iraq War, and that view at a certain point sort of said, and that's why we support, the resistance against the occupiers and so forth.
Oh, you don't even have to support the resistance to take a critical view. Listen, the point is not that you're missing the point. The point is that the Libyan opportunity, especially earlier on, and it's not lost completely, but some of it went away, was to do something that would have looked completely different from Iraq, that would have looked like a humanitarian rescue operation, and would have severed the notion that the United States acts only in its own interests, and that we regard dramatic change, revolutionary change in the Arab world, unless it's instigated by us, as undesirable. Okay, and that really would have sent a very, very powerful message. Obama has sent it to some extent, and his speech was very good. It would have been more powerful before, and that's why I think a certain degree of unilateralism and acting more alone would have been better. But truly, I mean, if you don't see the way in which the Libyan operation is regarded almost in an opposite way that the Iraq intervention was, you don't understand.
First of all, I do understand that they're viewed very differently. Okay?
Fine.
I get
Good.
that. Okay, but I'm also, what I'm saying
is
that the notion that Arabs are now becoming actors in their own history, okay? Iraq has had a head start in that regard. It's not perfect. It's still corrupt. There's still violence, and we now see there's protests.
Yes and no.
Government services. So I'm not saying it's Holland, but it's
yes and no. Yes and no. Here's the problem with it, though. It doesn't feel like that. I understand why you think that, but from an Arab point of view, it doesn't feel like that. Because even though there's an opening of political space and a lot of interesting and good things going on in Iraq in many ways, although there's still a lot of violence and tension, and we don't know the outcome ultimately. It may be good, it may be bad, we don't know. It felt like an imposition, and it felt like something the United States did for its own interests. And the reasons the United States gave, the Bush administration gave, kept changing about why it felt it necessary to intervene in Iraq, from weapons to mass destruction to Saddam Hussein being a threat to democracy promotion. It never added up, and it never resonated with the Arabs as anything other than another colonial intervention. This thing in Libya, the earlier it had been done, the less it would have looked like that, and it still doesn't really look like that. And that's a fact.
In the region, the viewers of Al Jazeera and all Libya.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not disputing that.
Correct.
I do think that for Iraqis, it was very different. They had a very different sense of it. They had to actually live under Saddam Hussein.
It depends on which Iraqis you're talking about.
Of being ignorant about what it was like to live under Saddam Hussein, and so they understood that when
I
they got to vote,
that there's
really
a lot
was
of Iraqis,
and I can understand why that I mean, it wasn't covered very much by Al Jazeera.
There were a lot of
but I'm saying
Iraqis.
that I can understand why other people would say, it still feels like a colonial intervention. But for Iraqis, I'm saying that I think that was an extremely significant event. And I will come out and say this, which will, probably you will disagree with. I think within this generation, I think within 10 or 20 years, or around 10 or 20 years, you will see, monuments to Bush for ultimately what will be seen as something that an intervention in Iraqi history that put it on a course that ultimately led to more prosperity.
Okay.
There.
Two things. First, it depends on which Iraqis you're talking about. Secondly, because there's a big difference of opinion in Iraq.
I know there is.
Secondly, I think it's possible. I doubt there'll be monuments to Bush, but I think it's possible that whatever. I think it's possible that in, say, 20, 25 years' time, Iraqis will look back on this and say that, well, a lot of people died and it was very painful and bad in many ways, but, it was for the best and this was good for us. I do not think it is possible that the Americans will look back on it and say, boy, was that worth it. So we'll see how it goes,
okay.
But I'm
we're going to agree to disagree,
sure
but I mean,
from the United States point of view, this was one of the biggest blunders in foreign policy history. Yes. Yeah, let's talk about the Arab Spring.
Let's talk about the Arab Spring for just a second, because I want to say that we didn't talk about the one place, which is Egypt. And you brought something up that I think is worth talking about again. And that is the notion that the United States does not intervene all the time just for its kind of, narrow self-interest. But don't you think that the handling of Mubarak ultimately, because, I mean, anybody watching Egypt, and Egypt was what really galvanized everyone's attention. Egypt is the first. I mean, Tunisia, of course, sets it off, but it's Egypt that everybody's really closely watching it first, right?
Of course, because as goes Egypt, there goes
right.
the
Okay,
Arab.
and right on this we
Except
totally agree. Anyway, but I want to just say that the action of Mubarak and Obama, ultimately Obama said. I mean, ultimately Obama pushed. I mean, I think the perception is Obama pushed Mubarak aside. He withdrew his patronage. And I think, sent the first powerful message. And I thought about this because my first thought was...
Yes, it was very
what
helpful.
Is General Kiani thinking? What is President Saleh thinking? Wow, this, the U.S. is not going to be so good. But then I look back a little bit, and I have to say, historically, in the Cold War at least, when there is a choice between a despotic client and a real democratic movement, the Reagan did not choose to side with Marcos. He chose Corazon Aquino. Eventually, after I think, holding on too long to Pinochet, eventually the United States helped push him aside and made him senator for life for a bit, and saw the kind of democratic transition.
Well, we didn't stop it.
Well, no, I'm just saying that oftentimes the part of the understanding, I think, of being a U.S. client is that if faced with a popular democratic movement, because the United States is a republic, and because the United States values freedom in a broad sense, or political freedom, it's you're not going to be able to. It's not going to be as good for you if you were, say, a client of China or Russia, which wouldn't care if you crushed and killed all these people.
That's right.
Hang on to power.
That's right, but there's a limit. There's a limit here, and Bahrain is the limit.
Yeah.
Okay, Bahrain is a very good example of where there's a limit to that. We've got the Fifth Fleet there. We've got serious. We and the GCC, our allies in the Gulf, have very serious concerns about Iranian designs in Bahrain, which are not fanciful. And because of those things, we are not going to be supporting the overthrow of the Khalifa family, even though it is a sectarian minority regime that has used great violence against its people and is a bit of a kleptocracy as well.
And this is an example, though, where, I think that there has been an attempt without success to persuade the Khalifa family that it's time to seriously reform and give your Shia majority equal rights. I think that has been the message. I think that it's been reformed.
There's been some gentle prodding.
It hasn't been.
Well, there's been some gentle.
Revolution. Right.
No. There's been some gentle prodding, But there's no doubt the Khalifa family stays.
Yeah.
Okay, it's as simple as that, because that's an example where our interests and our values don't come together. See, Obama, in his speech, with his criteria, said our interests and our values have to come together, unless, of course, our security is threatened, in which case we will act immediately. But Bahrain is a perfect example where our interests and our values do not come together, and our interests trump our values, and that's normal. Let me mention something broader that I've been writing about vis-a-vis the Arab Spring, if you can call it that, which is that there are three great pitfalls facing the Arab movements and also facing the Obama administration as it deals with these Arab movements. The first is the potential for military dictatorships.
Yep.
You've got in the two countries where the process is furthest along, where we can really track things in a credible way, Egypt and Tunisia, you've got transitional periods being overseen by military councils, okay? And it's just not clear how much power they're really ever going to give up. They may or may not. We'll see. So military dictatorships are a potential threat. I think it's unlikely that that's what's going to happen in Egypt, but in some other countries that could happen, and it's it's definitely a pitfall. The second one that concerns me is fragmented or failed states, and this may be emerging in Libya if the no-fly zone solidifies a stalemate, and as you were suggesting, maybe the rebels can't overthrow Gaddafi.
Well, I don't know.
Western Libya.
I'm giving you an
I don't either. I'm just telling you that it is imaginable.
It's imaginable
that Libya, for a time at least, splits into a Benghazi controlled area, a Tripoli controlled area under Gaddafi, and maybe some other areas, and who knows. And certainly when Abdullah Ali Saleh, the Yemeni dictator, says "Après moi le déluge," and if I go, my country splits into a dozen pieces. For once, it's not a ridiculous idea. That Yemen really could fragment. So the possibility of fragmented and failed states, Somalia on the Red Sea, Somalia in North Africa, is also something to be very concerned about. But the last one, and the one that concerns me the most, and where I think really Americans and Arab Americans, and not just the government, but NGOs and institutions can play a huge role, is in preventing the emergence of tyrannous majorities in parliamentary democracy. And what I was trying to explain in my last column in Now Lebanon, which was yesterday, is that the Arabs have, including a lot of the Islamists, including I think even most of the Islamists, have gotten the notion that government legitimacy depends on elections. Okay, that if you can't point to an election sometime in the past 10 years, you can't really claim to legitimately have power. In other words, they got Jefferson, right? They got the consent of the governed part. But what I think Arabs haven't gotten yet sufficiently, particularly Islamists, but all kinds of Arabs haven't gotten, is Madison. Yeah. In other words, the need for checks and balances, restraints on government authority, the need to put in very strong, extremely difficult to shift constitutional protections to defend the rights of women, of minorities, of individual citizens, etc., and that you're going to have a limited government that's going to be a representative democracy that can do a lot, that the majority will rule and can do a lot with their popular mandate, but there's a whole set of things they can't do. And that, I think, is something that hasn't sunk in. So I'd really like to see not just the U.S. government or USAID, but all kinds of NGOs, granting agencies, especially Arab American organizations, Arab European organizations, Muslim groups, those with close ties to the region and who work on these projects of democratization, stop pushing the election issue. That's a consensus among the Arabs now. Only royal families and ruling families on the one hand, or the most extreme Islamists like Al-Qaeda kind of people, are against elections now. It's a consensus in the Arab world that we should have elections. The thing we have to work on is the flip side of democracy, the Madisonian side. the limitations on government power, and how to control potentially tyrannous majorities. This we really need to work on, because you're going to get early elections in June or July in Egypt coming up, and there are only two organized parties, the discredited NDP and the Muslim Brothers, and they're poised to do very well. And there's a lot of I have a lot of concern that even in the best case scenario in the Arab Spring, where you have emerging parliamentary democracies, you might have tyrannous majorities emerging because Arabs have understood Jefferson, but they haven't understood Madison. And I want a campaign to push that second part and make sure that people understand that democracy is majority rule balanced with minority rights.
So the Ibish doctrine, as I said this to you in our pre-game conversation last night, calls for Arab democracy bonds similar to the Israel bonds of the 1940s, so that you want to see Arab diaspora professional communities
metaphorically
supporting, creating, funding liberal Madisonian democratic parties in Egypt and other countries to take on
not only parties, think tanks, NGOs,
this is party building. This is
people, opinion leaders, people who can explain this concept to the general public, because the general public got the election part, but not a lot of it didn't get the other part.
If I may,
so
George
there is
Soros,
the sense that
maybe a better investment for your money than looking up mid-level Fox executives to find out what they may have said on some social media site at some point might be to support liberal democratic parties in the Middle East. And I would encourage you to put Hussein Ibish in charge of your new Open Society Institute Arabia edition.
Well, there are better people than me. There are better people than me, and I want you them. So if he wants to call me, but I would also urge Olin and Scaife and Coors to do the same thing, rather than pouring their money into all kinds of wacko stuff.
Well, okay, but I got to tell you something, Hussein. Somebody needs to make sure that NPR doesn't turn us into gay socialist Muslims. So, I'm not
easy.
Anyway,
involved in
I want to just.
I'm not getting into the NPR thing. I don't even listen to it.
Your analysis, I think, is correct, and this emphasis on the importance of parties. But I want to just end on this note, because I've been a little bit, I've maybe had some control issues on Twitter, and I've been a little bit of a sourpuss, I guess. But I do want to say that I can foresee a scenario where the things that Obama's doing right now could end up really being historic in a very good way. So let me give you and I'm not saying it's going to happen, let me give you my super optimistic take that I think, kind of building on what you said. If Obama, this is not a doctrine about military force. I want to stress this is not about when to intervene, okay? But insofar as how to use American influence and power, if Obama has developed any kind of, he keeps using this idea that leaders need to have legitimacy to govern. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
This notion that if you lose the legitimacy, you lose the right to govern. Now, that's not backed up by, and will invade you if you lose the legitimacy, and that's not what I'm saying. But just the idea that the United States is only going to align itself, that to me is a very important signal to maybe the rest of the Arab Spring that hasn't sprung yet. Because what it says is if you create a critical mass in the streets, you question the legitimacy, and the government does not respond and instead represses you. Mm-hmm. At that point, the United States he's kind of locking the United States into not necessarily supporting the Bahrain, the Khalifa family. He's actually kind of locking in the opposite direction. If that works out, I'm not saying it will, but if it does, I kind of feel that that's a useful concept, which is that he's not saying that I'm going to try to change Saudi Arabia into a democracy overnight and invest, billions of dollars into USAID programs, which I think would have been a waste of money in some ways anyway. What he's saying is, if the Saudis seem to get it together and it looks like there's a democratic movement on the streets, the United States is going to, at that point, question whether the Saudi royal family, we'll see, that'll be the real test case, right? But in the case of Mubarak, a real ally, when the Egyptians sort of said, Mubarak's got to go, and Mubarak tried all these things to stave it off, and it didn't work. The United States didn't really spend a lot of time in the grand scheme of things wringing its hand backing their guy. They kind of, they moved
No,
on.
what we worked on, what we worked on, and here's the crucial thing. We worked on using the army to stage a soft coup that was sufficient to mollify the protesters and get an orderly process of change underway that is going forward in a non-ideal but functional manner. And that's what you want to support. Uncontrolled change, chaos, like we're seeing in Yemen and in Libya, certainly, and potentially brewing in Syria and other places, that is not helpful for the United States. And there is, I agree that the overemphasis on stability was clearly exaggerated at the beginning of the Obama administration. But at the same time, the chaos in the Middle East is unacceptable as well. So what you need to do is figure out a way to pressure, facilitate, and get the reformist elements within a lot of these regimes, and they do exist, and they get empowered when people start protesting to actually make the changes necessary. Bahrain is going to face a very grim future, probably a civil war, a sectarian civil war, if they don't move towards a constitutional monarchy. So what the United States ought to be doing in Bahrain is pressuring the Khalifa family to get rid of its hardline prime minister and use the crown prince, who's a much more constructive figure, to move in the direction of a constitutional monarchy that gives some power some real power to Shiites and other disenfranchised people, and addresses the land ownership issue, which is an outrage in Bahrain. A similar thing in Saudi Arabia. What you want to do where you have allies is controlled change, even where you don't have allies. If we could have had a controlled change in Libya, that would have been better. But in Libya, we were dealing with a psychopath, and the prospect of his victory was simply not acceptable. So, I think clearly there's a balance here between making it clear that we support change, reform, and democratization and accountability in the Arab world on the one hand, but that we don't want to see these countries burning up and on fire and going through Libya-like experiences on the other hand, is a good message, and it's a message that would be well received in the Arab world. What we need to disabuse people of is the idea that we're addicted to the status quo. Our intervention in Libya is a very good start.
The way he handled Egypt was not of a stability fetishist.
Correct.
He was not a Scowcroft H.W. Bush.
That's right.
Egypt. He was a Bush Wolfowitz on Egypt. So.
Yeah, neither of those things. He was Obama, and he has. You're right. In Egypt and in Libya, he has taken great strides towards disabusing people of that notion. And the more we can disabuse the Arabs of that notion and get on the side of Arab democracy and reform, the better off we will be for our own national interests. It's in our interest to do it, and we should. And so far we are. And I thought the speech the other night was another important step in that direction.
let me just the final question, and we'll do it very briefly. I think we've stumbled upon the original answer to our question. So what is the Obama doctrine? It is legitimacy promotion.
Yeah.
And that is and what it is it's not, he's not saying I'm going to transform everything regardless of where you are. He's saying if we get to that moment, and it seems like all these factors in the Middle East have shown up once again, those people who say Arabs are not ready for democracy, yada, yada, yada. But that's not our quarrel. Me and you,
ridiculous.
You know what I'm saying?
I mean, my book forum article shows.
Okay, anyway, but what he is saying is that in what I would I think I just coined a phrase, legitimacy promotion. So legitimacy promotion, I think in some ways, and we'll see it at some point, I wonder, doesn't legitimacy promotion kind of rub up against, the dream of Gulf 2000 and Gary Sick and Juan Cole and others to reach some sort of entente or grand bargain with the government in Iran? Wouldn't legitimacy promotion kind of, in some ways rub up against the notion that we can sort of wean Bashar Assad away from the Iranian alliance and work out some deal for the goal line. I mean, there are other regional priorities or traditional bipartisan objectives of U.S. policy.
Yeah,
that if you really are committed to legitimacy promotion, you would actually kind of have to say,
Yeah, that's why That's why it's your phrase and not my
I like
phrase. Because I do see several instances in which illegitimacy will be ignored for overriding national security reasons. Now, what I would say we have, I will reiterate what I said at the beginning. We don't have an Obama doctrine. We have an Obama set of criteria for the use of military intervention in certain situations. A, where our security is threatened, we'll do it unilaterally. B, where there is a confluence of our interests and our values, as happened when Gaddafi's troops were bearing down on Benghazi, we will act. And I think it's a very good set of criteria to follow at this point in time. And on top of that, it did finally, at last, really help to put us on the side of the Libyan opposition, and that helps put us on the side of the Arab Spring. So I'm overall very pleased with the policy and extremely pleased with the speech.
Okay. You don't like legitimacy promotion?
Well, I think it's an interesting idea, but I don't think it's going to be the guiding light because, as you say, when it comes to the situation regarding Iran or Syria or some other issues,
I don't know. I don't know. The indication is that they're through with.
There'll be other concerns that will trump the legitimacy question.
I think the Iranians are through with talking.
I like it. I like it.
That's what it seems to be.
Well, look, I like it as a concept. I like it as a I like it as a concept, and I think it does describe the Obama attitude towards many Arab states and the kind of standard that he's setting for Arab governments. But I think that there will be moments, like with Syria and with Iran, which is not Arab, but it is a Middle Eastern state, where the legitimacy issue is trumped by other issues. One final thought, which is that, it's on the back burner now. But the Israel-Palestine thing is still a great volatile issue, and we're just going to have to deal with it sooner rather than later. I understand they've become allergic to it in a way, but it has the potential for causing all kinds of mischief, and it needs to be addressed in a serious manner. There has to be another effort soon, aggressive effort, to make some progress there, or we're going to end up with some trouble because of that.
All right, well, that would be another dialogue, would it not? Let's just leave it. Let's leave it there.
Let's do it.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, fine. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Hussein Ibish.
Great to talk to you, and
all right,
we'll do it again soon.
All right.